everybody. This is Dr. Kyla Kamaat coming at you live today. I'm trying to get on this Thursday schedule here. Tuesday, Thursday, what is it? Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday schedule here. And I'm just going to take a look at my YouTube channel to make sure I'm on and I'm streaming something here. Give me a second so I can look at this. All right, I'm on. I'm on. Hi, everybody. I'm not sure where you are, but today in Atlantic City, New Jersey, it is absolutely divinely beautiful. Just period, point blank, beautiful outside. Sun is shining. It's a nice breeze, not too hot. It's a wonderful, beautiful, phenomenal day. And I hope that we are all grateful, no matter what the day is, the weather is, that we're all grateful to have another day to do this again. In whichever way you are doing this, right? I would say thankful for being alive. Everybody says that. That's an easy go-to. But thankful to be able to have the opportunities for me, communicate with you all, to have ideas that I can share. And I mean, we all have that, a creativity, a self-expression, just so many ways to be in the day, right? Gifting, paying forward, volunteering, cooking. I like to cook. Just so many ways to be in the day. So I'm just sharing all the blessings, all the goodness out there to everyone. Yes. And remember, there's synergy with the divine intelligence everywhere, including ourselves as a actual living, breathing 3D component, of this reality. I was thinking the other day that I'm having a 3D experience as a 5-dimensional being in a 2-dimensional space. That's intense. I've been thinking about that. And I know you're like, 5th dimension being, that's a whole nother live stream, right? That's a whole other live stream. But it's interesting. I was listening to some videos the other day, and this channel called Color Me Crazy. I really like this gentleman from Puerto Rico. He had a video up that was talking, he's looking at it through an astrology lens about what's happening now with planetary movements and, age of Aquarius, and just the ways in which planets are coming together, and Gemini. And the video that I watched was actually talking about how, we may be in bondage, right? And the way in which the planets are moving now, and he referenced, I think it was the 8 of Swords. If I'm correct, that's the woman, and I should know these, right? The woman standing with the blindfold on, her body's sort of, roped loosely, and there's like 8 swords, not completely surrounding her, but like in a semicircle, this divine feminine energy, which could be a divine masculine energy. And how at this time, those of us who have been in bondage, right? And it's not even a tight bondage. We're not like chained up. These loose ropes, this blindfold, how these astrological movements now, right? There's phenomena now that hasn't happened for like decades and eons, right? And how we're being called to question, right? To broaden our perspective, like the hangman, a new perspective, the hangman in tarot, to change our perspective in a way. And that's really hard, right? To change our perspective, to take a new perspective. According to Color Me Crazy channel, we are called into an energy and time now to just reconsider how we've been sitting in, taking up, participating in, systems. And he mentioned, I think, systems that are outdated and old, right? Or that do not serve us, right? And how we're being called to take a new perspective on, to begin to ask questions. And a lot of that's happening now. We can ask questions about what's happening out in the world many times, right? And that's, it allows us not to necessarily sit in ourselves. The question, what's happening within ourselves, right? And so this awakening, or this energy of questioning, and I would even call it a deconstructing what is, to actually see the finer points in what is. And I lost my thought. You know what? Look, I don't know if that's 59 or what, but I was in the groove right there. But it seems like a lot of that can take place with us looking out there. But, my work is about looking in here and questioning what is going on in here, right? All over here, right? And last week, I did a live stream on emotional intelligence. I'll be sending out some clips soon, but it is up on my channel. Feel the Power of Release, the Power Prophet. And so I touched upon this idea of emotional intelligence and the way in which it distorts our spirituality if we're not understanding the nuances of emotion, right? And I just put up some ways in which not being aware to grow our intelligence, the nuances of emotion, can cause problems for different areas of our spiritual embodiment, being. Okay. And so at the end of that live stream, I talked about getting into the next live stream would talk about like emotional distortion. And, and so this morning when I was sitting in my downloads and making my notes in my text messages, what I have to say isn't necessarily the definition of emotional distortion, although it has relevance, okay? And as you can see, out of tune, educational mis-attunement, emotional mis-attunement and spiritual discernment, okay? So while I went over the various areas of spirituality that are impacted by not understanding the nuances, and I did present the feelings wheel to get the nuanced portions of, anger, for instance. It breaks down into many more specific, nuanced emotions. It can impact our spirituality in the areas I presented. And so I didn't get into how. So today I'm going to talk about, like I said, being out of tune with your emotions, okay? The misattunement of our emotional selves, our emotional system, okay? And then the implications for spiritual discernment. I'm getting a little bit more specific into this, okay? So yes, I wrote down some notes and I did some research. Like I said, it didn't necessarily fit emotional distortion, which really ties in with emotional reasoning. And yes, distortion, negative thinking versus positive thinking, right? And a lot of my reframe work is around utilizing a more positive perspective regarding yourself, your beliefs, your values, and your behavior, your thoughts, your words that come out your mouth. Yeah. So that could be seen in emotional reasoning. If we have a negative frame, our emotions will be more negative. If we have a positive frame, the emotions will be more positive, right? Um, and that just is. So one's a higher vibration and one is a lower vibration. Forget the negativity and the positivity. One is a higher vibration existing in the higher mind, and the other one is a lower vibration, which brings everything down. Okay? The high vibration brings everything up and situates us in the realm of faith. Okay? The lower vibration is really disconnected from a lot of stuff. But it is what it is, right? So I wrote my little notes out after I did my little research, and really wanted to get into this deeply. The live stream today might be a little long, and as usual, I'll try to cut it in half or into pieces, smaller videos, so that it's more digestible to folks who need the mini clips. And for those of you who just want the whole bag of potatoes, sit in that live stream when it's finished here. But so again, today we're talking about attitude, emotional misattunement, and spiritual discernment. And so emotional intelligence asks us whether we feel and how we feel, as far as the descriptors of those feelings, how we're describing them. And emotional misattunement asks whether we feel truthfully. Okay? So before getting into emotional misattunement itself, I want to place this conversation in the context of the power of release framework, because everything on this channel has salience with the power of release program. And because, this is exactly where the problem becomes, where the challenge becomes spiritual and practically, in practical terms, significant. And so the work of recognize and release in the power of release program depends on a person being able to encounter their inner life with some degree of honesty. I would say with abject honesty, as close as we can get to it. So some degree of honesty, discernment, and emotional access. If someone is misreading like what they feel, or cut off from the body, projecting internal states onto other people, or confusing activation, motivation with truth, then the process in the power of release is immediately compromised, right? So sometimes it takes us getting into this emotional space, more emotion, more understanding of emotions, because these emotions are tied to patterns that no longer serve us. And if we're not understanding our emotions and what we're feeling, then it's hard to, first of all, discern what needs to be changed, what's not serving you. But it's also very difficult to release those emotions from that pattern in order to begin to reframe that particular area of existence. Okay? And so what many people think they recognize may already be filtered through this field of distortion, or this emotional field of distortion. And what they think they are releasing could possibly, not actually be a burden at all. And so that becomes even more serious in the context of spiritual awakening, which there's so much of these days, and people want to aspire toward that, to find some relevance in this whole spiritual milieu that is ascending in this around the globe, right? And it's calling on people to become more authentically connected with their spirituality. You know, people, they try to interpret emotionally charged experiences without enough grounding, and that's going to impact spiritual awakening. Or they may, they may interpret emotionally charged experiences uh, or guidance. Um, Give me a second. So, yes, people try to interpret a mostly charged experience without enough grounding, language, which is key, language, we name it, or guidance, right? To tell the difference between genuine insight and unresolved emotional material, which I've talked about many times, being this part of this internal residue that we embody based on many things in this world in which we live, facilitated by many things occurring in this reality that we inhabit. So, you know, the more difficult question, right? So it's already difficult. How do you really feel? I'm angry. Well, what's that mean? Threatened, violated? What? Somebody may not even know, right? And so the more difficult question, or I'm going to say another question of challenge, because all this work is challenging. Anytime you want to grow to be more than what you are, there is no click on, click off. It requires work. So, another challenging question is whether you feel accurately, can interpret what is felt with integrity or honesty, and whether your emotional responses remain in right relationship with the reality. I'm saying this 3D world, right? People call it illusion, you call it whatever you want, but we're all inhabiting this 3D reality. That's what makes it our reality. We can touch it, feel it, move through it, a 3D reality. And this is where emotional misattunement becomes a useful concept. Okay. It names a condition in which emotions are present, sometimes with considerable force, but no longer function as trustworthy guides because they have been shaped by more than that immediate moment. Okay. You know, we are taught often long before we can critically examine that teaching. We're taught which emotions are acceptable, which emotions are dangerous, which emotions are sign of weaknesses, and those emotions and which emotions can only be expressed in narrow conditions. Okay? And as a result, emotional life is not simply felt, it is organized. A system, conditioning, is organizing our emotional life. I talk a lot about the things that we take up in this reality, this social reality. And it's not in resonance with our true selves. And if it's not in resonance with our true self, but we have aligned ourselves with a mismatched resonance, then our emotions are in tow with that resonance that is really not anything that we have consciously conceived of. We're just participating and acting in it. And so some of the various ways that we're trained is through family systems, cultural expectations, racialized and gendered norms, religious messaging, and repeated experiences of reward and punishment. What emotions are being rewarded, what emotions are being punished. And a lot of that happens in family systems, right? If we do, look, we get punishment and we get reward. Well, in some family systems. Okay. And by adulthood, we are no longer responding only to what we feel. We are responding to what we have been taught to permit, suppress, aggravate, fear, or misname. Excuse me, I'm tickling my throat. I should have got some water. I always forget my water when I sit down here. And in that state where, what we know, the emotions has been what we think is permissible, what needs to be suppressed, exaggerated, feared, or misnamed, a person is not emotionally empty. Okay? That is a misnomer. They may, in fact, feel intensely while remaining estranged from the meaning of what they feel. So, emotional misattunement describes that estrangement. And it is the condition in which the emotional field is shaped by injury, defended identity, generational inherited scripts, and just out of survival patterns, right? And to such a degree that our perception becomes unreliable. We question if we saw what we saw, if we feel what we feel. And I talked about behavior, right? Looking at behavior because they communicate things. And we say actions are stronger than words, but we can't even perceive reality because what we're perceiving is unreliable. Is there a problem here in this relationship? And this person is doing all of these things to show you that they disrespect you and they don't care for you. It's not really a problem, but it requires a decision. But if we cannot discern because we believe that what we're looking at is unreliable, then we cannot make a choice. We cannot make a decision about whether to release or maintain or sustain this relationship. And so a person may call fear, right, intuition, because fear has become their most practiced form of vigilance, right? Fear, like they know something's going to go wrong. That's intuition. Or they know they may be rebuffed, right? And so they're calling that intuition when it's really fear. And there's numbness, right? You have a numb peace. Like, nothing sways me, nothing bothers me. This numb peace because of being taught that disconnection is strength. Being emotionally invulnerable is a source of strength. Excuse me. Anger could be seen as moral clarity, right? We see that acted out now, right? A moral clarity without recognizing the shame. We're acting that out in our political arenas. But, without recognizing shame, grief, or helplessness that lies beneath this. And so social conditioning deepens this challenge because it provides emotional habits with the appearance of truth. Appearance of truth. What has been repeatedly reinforced either by our own behavior, conditioning, so forth, and so on, begins to feel as natural as the air we breathe, right? Righteous or spiritually valid, even when our discernment is becoming much more narrow. Okay? And that is why emotional mis-attunement is not merely a matter of poor self-awareness. No. It is a serious disruption, and how a person comes to know themselves, interpret others, and is a participant in this 3D reality we inhabit. And so I have about 6 areas of this spiritual misattunement with an example that I want to go through. I believe it's 5 or 6. And so these areas, the reason why I diverged from emotional distortion, well, number one, that's the realm of psychology, and I'm not a psychologist per se, right? But I had a download as to the way in which this misattunement presents. And these are my intuitive downloads that I received regarding mis-attunement. Okay. And I'm going to go through these. We're going to talk about spirituality a little bit. All right. And so projection, we all have heard about well, not we all. Projection is talked about quite a bit on social media. And it's one of the clearest expressions of emotional misattunement. Projection reveals what happens when an internal condition is experienced, right? As though it were being generated by the outside world. And projection is our own emotional residue. And this is probably saying the same thing that I just wrote here, but I just want to be clear about this. So one is an internal conditioned experience as though we're generated completely by the outside world. Another form of projection is when you project your emotions in this 3D reality on people, places, and then they communicate back to you that emotional state, right? And so I'm going to give examples of this. So instead of recognizing fear, shame, resentment, and maybe insecurity as active forces within the self, the person encounters those emotions as evidence about other people. So, other environments or the meaning of an event. So it's inside of us. And maybe I wrote that a little, sometimes as a PhD, we can write a little convoluted and lose a little piece. What the heck was I talking about here? But we don't recognize what's in ourselves, but we see those emotions in other people, environments, and in the meanings of events. And this is what makes projection so powerful and so difficult to detect. It does not feel like misinterpretation while it's happening. It feels like perception. A person experiences themselves as responding to reality when in fact reality is already being filtered through unresolved emotional material. Okay? Material that has not been adequately examined. Projection often becomes especially entrenched when someone has learned to trust the force of a feeling more than the discipline of discernment. And so an example would be a person entering a room and immediately deciding that another individual dislikes them because the interaction feels tense, cold, or uncomfortable. So, this person can arrive at a conclusion quickly, and they may even feel spiritually and intuitively confirmed. Yet what is actually happening there is very, very different. Okay. The other person may be distracted, tired, socially awkward, or carrying concerns unrelated to the interaction. The tension being perceived is real as an experience that person is having, but the interpretation attached to it is being supplied by the projector's own emotional history, emotional residue. Okay? And if that person has a long-standing wound around rejection, being excluded, right? And being judged. That's a big one. The feeling of unease can harden into a false certainty that they are once again being dismissed. Look, that example's there because that example's me. All right. Piece of my experience there, which many, many, many people engage in projection. And as I've mentioned, don't even realize it. And so in that moment of interacting with that person, projection converts into inner activation. This person hates me. Into external fact. Look at their behavior. Look at what they're doing. When in fact, they're doing something completely different than what you are emoting. And it simply doesn't distort how a person feels, right? It distorts what they believe they know. And what they respond to verbally, behaviorally. Just get that. Put that in all kind of contexts. Love relationships, work relationships, family. It can be extremely problematic. Projection. And so another area of misattunement is a disconnect between emotions and the body. And this is one of the most consequential forms of emotional misattunement because emotion is not fully knowable apart from the embodied experience. We'll talk more about that. It's weird. People do not simply think their feelings, they register them through shifts in breath, muscle tension, posture, heartbeat, gut sensation, temperature, impulse, nonverbal behavior, things you may do, backing up, crossing legs in a meeting, uncrossing them, folding your arms. You know what I mean? And so when the nervous system is repeatedly organized around freeze, fight, or flight. Freeze is what you do when you're seeing something. You can either get your dukes up or you can run. Okay? So when our nervous system is in high alert, which it is right now for very many people, and it gets like that in heated arguments or encounters. And when we're trying to survive life, if our basic needs are not fully met, or we believe those needs are not fully met because we don't have any faith, right? That embodied channel, that nervous system response makes it harder to read the body with any preciseness. Because the body is no longer prioritizing discernment. And people can stay in flight and flight modality their whole life and not even realize it. They're always in survival mode, right? Like anything they do to stop is going to, and this doesn't have to be people with no means. This could be everybody, no matter what your income is. Something's taken away, everything's going to fall apart. That's sort of like catastrophizing, a feeling of catastrophizing, right? But in this flight, fight, and freeze mode of the nervous system, it's hard to feel your body. Okay? A person may sense intensity, intense feelings, but cannot figure out what's happening. And flight or fight doesn't, you can also be in a nervous system clench, even being in a love relationship. I mean, let's place this in a context where we're always tight, feeling like something horrible is going to happen. And that's many folks. So you got the intensity, but not the clarity. And you may know that something feels wrong, right? It could feel urgent and even threatening. Yeah? Or it could be just phenomenally unbearable. And we are unable to identify what emotion is happening: fear, shame, grief, anger, violation, um, um, overwhelm, exhaustion. The body is still communicating these feelings, but the signals are being received through a state of defense, a defensive state that compromises the emotional nuance. Okay, an example might be, listen, someone receiving a simple text from a loved one saying, "Can we talk later?" And that person who received that message feels their chest tighten, their stomach drops, oh shoot. And their whole system shifts into alarm. And I can't tell you how many times this happens, when I'm doing my psychic advising work, right? So-and-so said they want to talk to me later. Are they going to dump me? I mean, like, really? They go into fight, flight, freeze modality. The whole system, body system, shifts into alarm. So rather than recognizing the body sensations, right, as a sign of activation, as a sign of what's putting you into this body state, they move immediately into interpretation, as I just said, and assume conflict, where they're going to be abandoned or quit. Like I said, impending but bad news, fired, left behind. And by the time the conversation actually takes place, this person has already lived through and is living in a crisis in their own body with no facts. What was first a bodily signal of dysregulation, having a dysregulated nervous system when you get in that flight, fight, or freeze modality, becomes mistaken as evidence of what is real. Oh, they're going to quit me. Oh, they don't like me. Oh, I'm going to get fired. And look, that can lead to self-sabotage. That's another conversation, right? And so the danger of being of disconnection from the body, without embodied awareness, the person feels less, and they actually lose access to the very information they need to help them understand exactly what they're feeling. Emotional isolation. Emotional isolation often develops when a person's inner life has become so difficult to interpret, regulate, or communicate that withdrawal begins to feel safer than remaining in contact. Right? And, I hate to pick on men, but, a lot of times, we're talking about men's emotions and what's going on with them, some of my observations over time in my research and as a reader, men could get quiet, can't even talk, going into the man's cave in the mind. And so many times this interpretation is real. They don't know what's happening inside of them because men have been conditioned by this society to dismiss their emotions as being weak. And when you practice that for a lifetime, how you gonna know what's happening? You go into a man cave, you disconnect. I'm sure there's women caves. People disassociate all the time, right? And so, so that withdrawing feels much safer than remaining in contact, environments, people, events. Okay, and it is not always a dramatic rejection of other people, right? I don't want nobody around me. They get on my nerves. I need my peace. Keep them over there, right? Um, it often takes the form of quiet retreat, and this happens over time. Reduce disclosure. You don't talk so much. Some of this is, oh, they just don't understand me. Nobody understands where I'm coming from, right? So, quiet retreat, reduce disclosure, where you share things, right? Selective absence. Mary Jane's going to be over there. You coming? Yes. And they don't show up because they knew they weren't going to show up in the first place, but they didn't want to let somebody down. Right? That's still that emotional disconnect, right? Can't be truthful in your emotions. But where am I at here? Okay, and so there's often fatigue when somebody is going into emotional isolation. They don't want to bring out stuff because, let me go back. So, quiet retreat, reduced disclosure, selective absence, or an increasing conviction that genuine understanding is no longer possible. Like I just said, they don't understand me. Nobody knows what I'm going through. Beneath that pattern, however, is usually a more simple desire for solitude, fatigue, disappointment, right? Could be shame. I don't want to show my face. Or repeated emotional misrecognition, reading things wrong. That has taught the person that being known will not bring relief. Okay? Instead of risking further misunderstanding or what they're projecting as misunderstanding, they begin to seal themselves off and live inside a private emotional world. Many times we encounter these people, they just don't have emotions. I mean, like you don't see anything happen to them, like out and about. They're walled off. And it could be a protective mechanism. I mean, it could be just, I'm at work. I'm not going to, I'm just saying work as an example. I'm not going to show this. But, yeah, it could be a little bit more than that. A real disconnect and desire to just put everything on lockdown, which plays out in love relationships, family relationships, all kind of relationships. Okay? And so and this matters what I'm talking about here with this emotional isolation, because isolation does not merely protect feeling. It deepens distortion because there's nothing for else you to go on with. You're not sharing your emotions, not getting any feedback in any type of way. Not that you're talking to a therapist, but you get feedback from how people relate to you, right? It's not tested in a relationship. So the distortion is deepened. And once a person is alone with an unchallenged interpretation of their experience, that pain can harden into certainty. Like this is what it is. So a clear example that I wrote down would be someone going through a difficult season in life, feeling increasingly overwhelmed, right? And deciding to stop returning calls because nobody gets it. Anyway, having a hard time for, it's been a hard time. I just feel so overwhelmed. People are calling, what's going on? Screw them. They don't get it anyway. They don't know what's going on, right? At first, it could be the withdrawal is self-protection, right? It's sensed as self-protection. I'm protecting myself, right? I got enough problems, right? And over time, however, the lack of contact confirms the very story they are living inside, right? Silence from others starts to feel like abandonment. Not returning anybody phone calls, they start calling. Then you're like, oh my God, nobody cares about me, right? Even though that silence is partly created by this retreat into emotional isolation. And that way, emotional isolation becomes self-reinforcing. The person is not only suffering they're not only suffering like I'm having pain, but it's in a closed loop. That repetitive pattern, right? A closed loop where the absence of relational contact, interpersonal contact, gives their private interpretation of what's happening even greater power. Okay? So now we have another one. And this actually relates a lot to projection, right? It's called misreading emotions. You know, we misread our own emotions. It always carries over into misreading emotions in others. Emotional discernment is not divided neatly into private and emotional domains, repetitive patterns, neither, right? The capacity to identify what one is feeling develops through interpretive clarity, required to read other people with nuance. And when that clarity is weak, a person tends to rely on assumptions, which make an ass out of you and me, but rely on assumptions as to what's happening within themselves, and reading somebody else is what's happening in that person. They rely on speed. You know, they don't sit in it to understand it. They just want to rush past it, right? And emotional habit. Misreading is just something that they do inside and outside. And it's a habit. Don't even think about it. There's no longer careful perception. It's these stereotypes, these boxes, these assumptions we lay on people, right? And so these areas of assumption, speed, and habit may confuse discomfort with hostility. You know, it could cause directness to be direct with aggression. Or somebody could say that they have empathy or they're sad, but it's indifference. Okay? And this happens because the inner instrument through which they interpret emotional cues is already compromised, because they cannot read their own emotions. This goes all across every context of life. And the idea about projection, which I was going to say, is that if people are projecting their internal emotional world into a 3D reality and seeing what they feel about themselves reflected in others, that is a misread, and it impacts all levels of relationship, right? So this could be a real situation. And look, this idea of being disconnected from the body and emotion is in here too, right? The misread is a part of that. You can't discern because you're not even sure how it's showing up in your body. And so a clear example, take a woman, for instance, divine feminine energy, and that could be any gender identified woman, sharing something vulnerable, telling a secret they never told anybody else, with a friend, somebody they trust. And they notice that their friend has become quiet and serious. If the divine feminine energy sharing this secret has an inability or little ability to discern her own insecurity, her own emotional state of insecurity, she could come to the conclusion that the friend is judging her because the friend got quiet or is not interested, you know, or can't take on that emotional weight and is withdrawing emotionally. That friend may do, right? Withdraw emotionally from the conversation. When in reality, the friend is listening very carefully, active listening, as a matter of fact, has a concerned feeling, and or taking some time to hear, discern for an appropriate response that's careful and compassionate. So what is being misread is not only the other person's emotion, but the entire relational moment. Give me a second here. I got to get this phone call. It's my son. Hello? I'm in the middle of a live stream. Sorry about that. If you've been listening to my live streams, you know my son got a job in the big city, New York City, and moved out the house in New York. And, I still got my mommy umbilical cord. So when he calls, I got to answer. Forgive me. So we're talking about the friend who was misreading her friend's emotion in being told a secret, right? And so what is being misread in this situation is the person's emotion and the complete relational moment. What could have been bonding becomes defense, becomes broken when it's nothing of the sort. And that's really why emotional misreading is so very important. It creates confusion about feelings in ourselves and in others, and then it alters meaning. It shapes behavior, how someone behaviorally responds, and it can actually damage a relationship, a close relationship, where there was nothing threatening in the first place. So misreading, all of these are very important, right? They all can cause some very real challenges in ourselves, in our relationships, and our capacity to navigate life. So the next one I call emotional bias, okay? And emotional bias develops when a person is conditioned to treat certain emotions as morally suspect, socially dangerous, or not aligned or incompatible with the identity they are expected to sit in, to maintain. In that context, emotional life is not approached with openness, but with internal censorship. We hold the bias regarding our emotions. You may not simply feel or fail to notice the feeling or somebody else's feeling, right? It just becomes disqualified before it can even be examined. Anger could be rejected as disrespectful in some ways. Growing up, understanding that anger is a bad emotion to have and that is disrespectful. Grief could be seen as a weakness. Are you still crying about that? Are you still sad about that? Envy can be seen as shameful. Envy is a bad word, or they're envious. Then in many ways, if it's out of control, it could be dangerous. You should be ashamed of yourself. Right? Envy. That's a good one. Fear as failure. If you're scared, you're just a failure. Right? Fear. You're just scared about. Or tenderness as exposure. Right? That's a big one. And as a vulnerability, if you're tender, right? If you care, you're careful. Um, so tenderness could be rejected. All these could be rejected. Grief is rejected, envy is rejected, fear is rejected, tenderness is rejected. You too soft. Men, divine masculine energies. Over time, this creates a selective inner world. We can't even be honest inside. It's a selective inner world, okay? In which some emotions are allowed to be are allowed legitimacy, while others are forced underground, where they continue shaping perception and behavior, but there is no conscious acknowledgement of the way in which they are, okay? And that is what makes emotional bias really problematic, especially all this is for the Power of Release program. But if you have completely said crying is for babies and you never cry, that's a challenge with releasing patterns tied to whatever emotion that crying is aligned with. You know, it narrows our self-knowledge, right? Because the honesty is not there. By making emotional access becomes dependent on social approval, religious approval, our partner's approval, rather than truth. Example, someone's raised to believe that anger is unacceptable because good people stay calm. People stay calm. And strong women do not complain. So this divine feminine energy may interpret her own anger as a character flaw. Something wrong with me. I'm broken because I'm angry. Rather than as data or information about being violated, maybe depleted, or as having, a boundary crossed, right? Instead of recognizing the feeling and asking what it reveals. This divine feminine energy may cause stress, swallow it, and continue on with whatever is being done with quiet resentment accumulating under the surface. I think many of us can attest to that resentment or something quietly accumulating that we've been holding inside, something we need to say, get off our chest because it has an emotional import. But we just sit on it. In that situation, the problem is not that anger is absent. Okay? The real issue is that conditioning, family, society, religious, cultural, and even intergenerational or generational inherited patterns, right, of emoting, has trained this divine feminine energy to misname emotions, not have trust in the emotions, and just dimming an emotional signal that may have provided some understanding about what was no longer sustainable, right? things that do not serve us, patterns that do not serve us, if we're not engaging with those emotions that can signal that, then we just sit in it. We have, how many more? We got 1, 2. We got 2 more to go. So the next one, pass the buck emotions. Like I said, these are downloads to me. Pass the buck emotions. This is a pattern in which a person locates responsibility for their emotional life, primarily outside of themselves, right? And comes to believe that other people are obligated to keep them steady, repair their distress, prevent difficult feelings from arising in the first place. And the big one is to keep me happy. I need somebody to help. I need somebody to keep me happy. This does not mean that relationships are unimportant, right? We all know they are, okay? Or that we as humans, do not need care, attunement, and co-regulation, right? We do. The problem begins when emotional support is confused with emotional responsibility. You are responsible for how I feel. At that point, the individual no longer treats their inner life as something they must learn to witness, interpret, and manage, ideally with increasing maturity. No. There's an organization of life, relationship, around the expectation that other people carry the burden of keeping that person emotionally together. That's a lot. I don't know if any of you have been in that situation. That's a lot. And that expectation presents a distortion in relationships. Disappointment, any disagreement, any limits placed. And even just ordinary, like human inconsistency, we go up and down, right? Are no longer experienced as part of relational life. They're experienced as violations. I shouldn't feel this way. What are you doing to me? I gave a whole bunch of examples, I think. But what I actually wrote down is, we have a divine entity who already feels anxious and perhaps a little unsettled whenever a close friend does not respond to a text quickly. Rather than recognizing the activation, right? The feelings being stirred up as their own emotional material to examine. They're convinced that the friend is causing the distress and therefore has a duty to fix it through immediate reassurance, constant availability, or repeated proof of care. I don't know about you, but I've seen this, not even as an advisor, but just in life, period. In several contexts with an individual. If a friend does not comply with immediate reassurance, constant availability, or repeated evidence of of caring for this person, the individual who's like tripping out may interpret that as neglect or betrayal. And in that moment, there is a displacement of responsibility in which another person is assigned the task of regulating a person's inner world they did not create and cannot sustainably control. That's a big ask. And that is so far from self-sovereignty. I don't know what is. When you put your emotional health under the control of somebody else, because that person could be an abuser, you know, emotional abuser, master manipulator. Gotta be careful. I think the last one here, yep. The last one is emotional death. And that is a severe form of disconnection where divine entity is so estranged from feeling that emotion no longer functions as a meaningful source of restraint, reflection, or relational awareness. Emotional death. And look, this is not ordinary composure, having a certain amount of composure to yourself. It's not even temporary numbness where you just get numb for a brief moment because something's going on. Or that you could possibly be fatigued from stress, right? Just tired, right? It is a deeper severance from internal life in which the person no longer experiences their own emotional reality with enough access for it to shape conscious, to allow flexibility in perception, or to interpret harmful behavior. When that break becomes pronounced, right, that disconnect, other people's emotional states also lose significance. So what happens above happens below. What happens within happens without. You feel emotional death inside, you're not going to see any emotion outside of yourself. Other people's emotional states lose significance because the individual is no longer related to humanity through felt recognition. I mean, we're seeing a lot of that right now within our political world. Folks who have emotional death can sort of discern, conceptually, they know what happiness is, fairness, sadness. They know what they are conceptually. Grief, fear, tenderness, humiliation, or remorse. Like, they have a definition for that, whether it's like a denoted meaning, one that comes from the dictionary, or one that's they come up with themselves a subjective definition. Connote, denote. Denote is the definition. Connote is a subjective interpretation of something necessarily aligned with standard definitions or in a dictionary. And so what is really absent is living contact with those 3D realities as an energetic force that matters. That absence is extremely dangerous, as we're seeing play out now in our political environment. Because emotion is a part of what makes another person's suffering register as consequential. Without that contact to see, observe, feel, know what's going on, action becomes increasingly instrumental, a means to an end, detached, not feeling nothing, and morally indifferent. Good, bad? Who cares? Okay? So an example, I could give one from the world of politics, but here's another example. I kind of poo-poo on that idea. So someone has spent 9 years cutting themselves off from pain. Until they can end relationships, humiliate others, or exploit trust without any genuine pause. Let me say that again. A person who has spent years cutting themselves off from pain internally and externally, right? Until they end a relationship, humiliate others, or exploit trust without any genuine pause or reflection, right? They may describe themselves as simply being logical, strong, or no longer affected by the drama. What does it affect, man? Yet, what appears to be a strength is a devastating collapse in emotional participation. The issue is not only that they may have a transcendent feeling or feeling of superiority, right? The only emotions that matter in my head, right? It is that they have become unreachable by the very capacity that makes care, remorse, and mutuality possible. Mis-attunement is devastating. You know, emotional attunement has a serious impact on spirituality. I already talked about how it impacts the individual, maybe some people in their circle. But when we drill this down into its impact on spirituality and spiritual awakening, look, spiritual life depends heavily on discernment. Okay? And discernment is unstable when a person is not in a right relationship with their own emotional realities. You know, many people enter spiritual practice hoping to become clearer, freer, and more connected to truth. However, they also may do that within an emotional field, within an emotional energy field that has been warped or shaped by wounding, projection, suppression, fear, dependency, and a defended identity. Okay. And if that material remains unexamined, spirituality can become less a path of awakening than a language through which old confusion is given new authority, right? So it's like taking something that was or is, not addressing it, but packaging it in a new material, thinking things are going to be different. I've talked about that. Okay. Fear, like I said before, it can be intuition, right? But that fear is operating from old wounds. You get a flood of emotions, right? When you have some of that spiritual contact, right? And it could be like a revelation. When that emotional flooding is something completely different. Being numb, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in peace. Something I gotta knock on my own self. Am I numb? Right? Because I feel sense of peace. Feel peaceful. I don't think I'm emotionally numb. But that thinking and discernment is only due to self-reflection, right? Somebody could be hyper vigilant. What's going on? What's going on? And that could be seen as discernment, right? Hypervigilance. Sometimes that's tied with paranoia. And that's not spiritual discernment. The challenge is that emotional misattunement compromises the inner instrument, as we talked about in the live stream on emotional intelligence, through which emotional experience is perceived, interpreted, and becomes active. So it's difficult to distinguish between a real spiritual insight and any emotional residue, right? That's clothed in that new box with sacred meaning. And this is especially, when we talk about spiritual awakening, this is even more critical. We think about the idea of awakening. Awakening often intensifies unstable. And it presents, hidden stuff within us close to the surface, brings it up. And while that process can be profoundly clarifying, it can also become disorganizing, okay? Because when a person lacks the emotional grounding to metabolize what is emerging, that is messed up. Because you can't get those eyes to open, the mind to open, the heart, the body. Instead of deepening into humility, sobriety, and or truth, they may become more attached to sort of emotional charged interpretations that really sort of just flatten itself. There's no deepness there. And it just sort of, even though it's seen in a sacred meaning with a new meaning, it can actually affirm and confirm the old wounds that we have. And which is worse, we can bypass the difficult work of inner examination because we already feel through these emotions that may not necessarily be sacred, we already got it. Emotional misattunement also interferes with relational and ethical dimensions of spiritual growth, okay? A person who cannot read their own emotions accurately may confuse, being reactive, reacting to something with righteousness, and call it self-righteousness, right? They're projecting something out there is going to happen, and then they call it prophecy, when in fact, it's just their own emotional world being reflected back to them. Or they can use this highfalutin spiritual language to really sidestep harm or harm that's being caused. And in that sense, we're not just talking only private confusion, because as we've talked about, this affects how we relate to others, how one interprets guidance, right? Spiritual teacher or a book, how one understands transformation itself. Spiritual awakening requires more than just an expanded consciousness. Hence the power of release. It requires increasing honesty about what is moving within, so that when we say we have a spiritual insight, we are speaking with metaphysical confidence and not through our own emotional residue, okay? And so I have 3 ways. I talked a lot, and I'm sure we could find ourselves somewhere in what I talked about today. I have 3 strategies that may help begin to move forward your awareness. So one way to self-evaluate emotional misattunement is to examine whether the intensity of your interpretation, how you're interpreting something, is beyond what the facts are saying. Could be catastrophized. Everything's going to fall apart when no facts are supporting this. Or you're magnifying an issue as big as I don't know what, when there's nothing to support the magnification of that situation. And that practice, you got to pause long enough to separate what you're feeling, what you're assuming, and what you know, what's observable, what has been seen. And if a reaction or response feels immediate, no, I'm going to say reaction. If in a reaction, because reactions occur, bam, right away. If it feels immediate, all-encompassing, like total, and self-validating, I know what I'm talking about. That is a sign to slow your roll, babies. Rather than seeing it as a sign that your perception is accurate. Another self-evaluation tool in looking at emotional misattunement is to evaluate your relationship with your body, to your body during emotionally charged moments. And all this requires being mindful. And mindfulness takes sitting quietly and feeling your body, noting what's around you, what you can hear. It's a meditative state that always isn't a deep meditation. But if you can assess what's happening to your body when you are heated, you ask yourself, where am I feeling this? In my gut, in my chest. Where is it registering physically? I think that's a good space, right? And whether your body feels available to being or opening up to gain awareness, or is it just completely overtaken? You can't feel anything. It's like a moment of mindfulness. Okay? And so difficulty locating emotion in the body can often mean, that your ability to discern can be replaced by survival patterning, right? And survival patterning doesn't serve anybody unless you're just in a state of survival, life, death. So you want to note where you feel the emotion in your body. What does it feel like? Because then you can note when you had that feeling again. And then you can note what circumstances give rise to that body sensation. And that's where the work of recognizing, release, and reframe comes in. Last strategy for self-evaluation of emotional misattunement is look at the patterns, the reoccurring relationship patterns that you have. And try to be really honest about this. This is also hard. Journaling sometimes can open up honesty more than sitting there thinking about it, right? So pay attention to whether or not you repeatedly feel misunderstood, repeatedly feel judged, repeatedly feel like someone has abandoned you, or repeatedly feel like you are not stable in many contexts. You're just kind of wobbly, out of balance. So you can write this down, right? Isn't it being a moment? But you can think about this and see where you have felt this reoccurring pattern. Okay, and then ask whether the pattern may reflect more than someone else's behavior, right? That means it's not just that person. So you're reflecting on whether it's that person or whether it's you. That person, that would be them misjudging you, them misunderstanding you, them misjudging you, them abandoning you, them destabilizing or keeping you out of balance across contexts, right? But you want to reflect on if that's really true. That pattern keeps occurring. Is it really that individual? So repetition doesn't automatically mean that your perception is wrong. It doesn't mean that at all. It might suggest, however, that your emotional framework may be organizing your experience in ways that deserve a closer examination. Okay? Taken together, these self-evaluation strategies, these practices can help you begin to assess whether or not you're responding to this present 3D reality with accuracy or engaging the world within an emotional energy field that is shaped already there through injury that has not been examined, right? Wounds, conditioning, family, religion, or some interpretation that you have that needs to be defended. Okay? I know I talked a lot today. Oh my God, it's almost an hour and a half. Look, if this conversation has helped you recognize even one place where your emotional life may be shaping your perception more than revealing the truth, do not leave that awareness at the level of reflection. Emotional misattunement has real consequences for how you interpret yourself, how you relate to other people, and how you move through your spirituality and spiritual awakening. Which is why this work deserves structure, language, and practice. Okay? Oh my gosh, I talked my mouth off today. I know I got a new background. I'm at the dinner table, right? I'm sure that I will have a really nice studio office. Right now, it's my creative expression with what I have to creatively express with at this time. So, as I was saying, we got to give structure, language, and practice to really getting in tune with our emotions in order to make change in our life. All right. And I have several guides that were created to help you begin the process with even greater clarity. And so I'm going to try to do what I am never able to do, but I'm going to do it now. I'm going to put screen in screen. Let's see what I can do here. All right. So give me a second. I'm going to pull up the first guide. Okay. So what just happened? Is that what that looks like? I guess it does. So the first one I'm sharing is scarcity. These are all complementary. Okay? All complementary. What's happening here? I don't like this. How do I get this fixed? What's this? Oh, I got rid of it. Customize. I want this gone. Sorry, y'all. Remove. Oh, there we go. Maybe. So you may not be able to see this, but this says scarcity pain matrix expressions across life contexts. Okay, now there is a book up there called Transcend on the Scarcity Pain Matrix. This is sort of a sort of a quick view of how it shows up and the emotions that may be attached to these contexts as evolving through scarcity, pain, and fear. Okay, and there is one that goes into depth. I mean, not a huge treatise, but like a few paragraphs. And then this has a quick view guide. So career, love, but you can look it up and see what are the points. Can I make this bigger? Let me see. Let's make it smaller. I'm just trying to get it in the a little bigger. Yeah, I'm new to this. You can tell that. That's all right. So, inside, these are in the form of a flip book or a PDF. And the flip book can be downloaded as a PDF, right? Um, and so this is one scarcity pain matrix expressions across life context. This can help bring a level of discernment to the work you may want to engage in understanding your emotional tuning. Okay? Where'd that go? And I have another one, which is this is, can you see it? Oh, I don't know what's happening here. Oh my goodness. Always trying to do something new. And it's a little bit hard to get it in there. That's the one I'm on. Maybe I'll do this one. Maybe I'm not. I need something where I can show. What's this? Share screen. Give me a second. Oh, it's easier now. Which one is it? This one is called misaligned resonance, where you recognize where the scarcity, pain, fear matrix is controlling your life without permission. This is a little deeper dive, okay? So it gives a starting point to deconstruct where you may have pain patterns, fear patterns, and scarcity patterns that you have not signed on to. This is also part of the emotional work, misaligned resonance, okay? And we have another one, which is, let me get to the next one. This one is called presence. This is going to be really good because it helps you to discern. It helps you to get in touch with your intuition, to become more aware about what's going on. It's also going to help mindfulness for pattern recognition and emotional release readiness. Okay, and all these have exercises and guides. Okay, guided questions, reflections. All right, so this is a guide for intuitive awareness, pattern recognition, and release readiness. Okay, and now we also have two more that I'd like to show you. And this next one is called Unlocking Potential. Okay. And all these are complementary. And this is the release sequence. You know, practice and tools to shift your resonance to purpose aligned choice. So the release sequence is getting in tune with those emotions. Because in order to transform your life, you got to get your resonance out of alignment with something that has nothing to do with you. It's not your resonance. Unlocking potential. Okay. This is another free guide. Again, it's a flip book. You can download it as a PDF. And lastly, we've got one that is absolutely important to this work as well. And so this one is called, oh, it's showing already, The Body Speaks, Recognition Practice Guide. How do we recognize what the body is saying? The body speaks. Again, exercises, explanations. These are brief guides, okay? And so these are all available excuse me. These guides are all available via, oh my goodness, I didn't even put on my welcome ball thing. These are all available via the link in bio. Access free practices guides. Yes, that's me. Yeah, that's me. I've been kind of on the down low with my hair, but yeah, I've got various dimensions of self that like to be expressed. And so, link in bio, you can access all of these free guides. Okay, so that's the QR code here, or go to my link in bio on my channel, and you can get them from there as well. And I just want to say, these resources are what am I doing here? These resources are a beginning. Okay, they are a beginning. All right, and what that means is they're not the end of the work. Okay, these guides help you name what is operating beneath the surface, reconnect with your inner world, and they prepare you for a deeper release. I have to say, some patterns demand more than solitary insight than you working alone to really unwind them, okay? If something in you knows it's time to go deeper, I invite you to start there and then continue to work with me directly. And I'm just saying that because right now, it's a good time for stuff, because we are having a 75% promotional discount. You first-time clients, okay, get 75% off eligible transformational resonance sessions, okay, which makes this an especially powerful movement to move beyond recognition and into guided change, okay? Not only is this an opportunity to get started with the work, but it's an opportunity to engage with me in the capacity as a transformational resonance guide. This is the QR code that goes directly to the website where you can look at what sessions are available. Okay. And yeah, what you would do is you pay for them through the link, you get the invoice number, and then you book your session on a calendar that I have. It's a workaround, okay? You pay first, get the invoice, and then you place it into the form that you're using to book your appointment. That way I know you paid. And that way I need that 75% discount, right? QR code, get your session. I'm just going to throw this up there. Anybody interested in getting a 10-minute complimentary somatic metaphysical tarot reading? You get 10 minutes just to see what it's like. This is the tool I use in the recognition phase, among many. Okay. Check it out. I'm only talking transformational resonance work here today. Okay. There's a QR code. Sign up and claim your reading. You might even do that before you do 75% off, right? I got all kind of steps, baby steps, to help folks discern the path they would like to follow with me or without me. Yeah. All right, I'm hiding that. My goodness. We're going on a little more than an hour and a half. You know what? For anybody who's watching this, I thank you. I don't know if I'm going to do a part 3 to this. I think I talked about it enough. So I'm going to get into something else. on Thursday. Okay. And yeah. But you know what? I'm going to say bye bye. Look, if anything resonated, please comment. You know, what's your relationship to your emotions? What is your personal relationship to your own emotional life? Please comment. Like. The likes help, moves it up in the algorithm, and subscribe does a phenomenal thing with the algorithms as well. I usually have a reticence behind asking people to comment, like, and subscribe. That is a pattern of insecurity that is still weeding out. Yeah. Comment. What is your relationship to your personal relationship to your own emotional life? Like this video and others, and subscribe so you are aware of when we're dropping new videos and when we're having live streams. Okay. So, today we talked about attitude, emotional misattunement, and spiritual discernment. And I thank you, all you beautiful souls, for those who sat with this and those who will sit with it later. I appreciate you all. And on that note, I'm going to exit stage right. Or is that left? You know what? Enjoy your blessed day. Do something kind for somebody. Say something kind. And take a moment to just sit down and feel the chair, your feet on the ground, your back against the back of the chair, your shoulders, your arms, your hands, your face. And listen to see what sounds you can hear. That's a mindfulness, meditative state. I encourage you to try it every now and then. All right? Have a blessed day. I appreciate you all, beautiful souls.